All right, thanks everybody for joining us this afternoon. We've seen a lot of examples of different sorts of IP, right? We saw the Game of Thrones game earlier in the day, which is an example of licensed in IP for Warner Brothers for that game. And we've obviously seen examples of games that are organically created IP for the studio. And we're gonna drill down on really that question today. And I wanted to set up a hypothetical for you. And the hypothetical is, there's an idea for a game, and the question is, do we build the IP entirely ourselves, or do we license in the IP from a known brand? How do you go about making that decision as to what's the right decision for a particular game or for a particular studio? What are some of the factors you'd look at and think about in that process?
So on the Scopelys side, when we consider a new game or a new opportunity, what we're really looking for is this a deep immersive experience, deep immersive world that can last for multiple years and actually sustain a more evergreen type of game franchise around it? So generally, I think if we see the opportunity to kind of build on top of a rich world that already exists and feel like we can express that world well through gameplay, then that's a great opportunity to dive in from the IP side. But if it's a novel mechanic or something that's really unique and doesn't naturally fit with the IP world, then for us, that's when we kind of double down on building that world ourselves.
Yeah, and I would add to that, ultimately boils down to your business model, right? When you consider an IP, you're going to value the quality of the IP, the reach, the demographics, and you're going to define what is your expected install. Is there competition around CPI for that brand? Is that brand used by other titles on the mobile market? And you're going to also combine it with what is your expected LTV for that game genre. If the positive outweighs the negative, then probably this is the right game for your company. If you can't make that math work, then potentially you need to either reevaluate another IP or just switch to an original IP of your own.
In terms of game mechanics, can we talk a little bit about that? To what extent does a mechanic impact the decision about the IP either to be licensed in or created?
I think it's a heavy influencer. So just to give an example from within the Scopely ecosystem, we made the decision several years ago that we wanted to enter the strategy category, the 4X space. And it's a very compelling category for a number of reasons: deeply social, long-lasting gameplay, and we thought we had the expertise to build something meaningful in that space. So when we thought about how do we do this, how do we do it the right way, it's a very competitive space, very competitive market for original IP. But what we found was with an IP like Star Trek, there was this amazing opportunity to build upon a world that naturally has conflict, naturally has exploration, naturally has all of these things that are kind of core to that game genre. So it ended up being a very natural fit to try to build our entry into that category around that IP. I think in cases where the mechanic is novel or very, gamey, for lack of a better way to put it, you can fall into the trap of trying to jam a mechanic into an IP, and those are usually the failures, right? Because it doesn't resonate with what people are looking for from the brand, from the experience.
Yeah, I think you need to put yourself in the shoes of the audience you're trying to reach and see what the pillars of the brand are. I think, Jori mentioned Star Trek. Yes, it has exploration. It's the final frontier. Meanwhile, for something like Marvel, it's about the hero. It's about the fighting. It's about defeating, incredible odds. And we've seen plenty of titles that believed erroneously that Marvel or another brand, let's say Star Wars, because the audience of the movies was so broad, that you'd be able to capitalize on the brand, you'd be able to create a game that was going to win regardless of the genre. And ultimately, I think most of those games that were built without understanding the pillars of the brand have failed most of the time. A good example is Star Wars Droid, which was a match 3 with Star Wars. And ultimately, that did nothing. Another game, I think, that misunderstood the brand was Disney Battle Heroes. It's a game where you are mixing Disney characters with a very hardcore RPG mechanic. And it was hard for the Disney fan to attach themselves to a brand they identify as something very comforting and casual.
So there's value in creating a really iconic IP. There's no question. And that's part of the reason why you would think about licensing it and is to capitalize on that value. Obviously, if you can create it, you're creating immense value for the company, both in terms of the IP itself, merchandising opportunities, esports opportunities, et cetera. To what extent does that potential original IP that you own and have exclusive rights to impact the decision-making process when thinking about what's right for a particular opportunity?
Yeah, I mean, it fundamentally changes the dynamics of the business. I think, Jeremy mentioned it a bit earlier, but, wholly owning that IP means that you're not paying royalties. You have the chance to kind of bring it to multiple games in the future or other platforms, other media forms. So it's a fundamental equation changer. But on the flip side, I think the interesting thing from my perspective is that in order to build a brand, build a world well, you have to be ready to put a significantly larger investment behind it. Like some people say, licensing IP is expensive, but another way to think about it is it's a very cheap way to access a rich, immersive world that already has an audience attached to it. So in one way or another, you have to pay to get that audience. And it's just whether it's paying upfront for the IP or paying user by user to build the world around it.
Yeah, it's a great question, especially for Jam City right now. We're in the midst of that process. We have a title coming out at the end of February on the 20th called WellThought, and it's a brand new IP we've created, and it's an IP we have really big desires to grow even outside of mobile. So there's a ton of conversations we're having about, hey, what about creating physical assets? What about creating physical events? How could we create a cartoon out of it? There's not a clear model for it. A lot of it is just our internal belief that we've created an IP that is resonating with the audience we're testing, and we believe that we can scale that audience and really create a property that we can sustain for many years to come.
I want to follow up on that idea, Jeremy, and I don't need to get into the specifics, but if you've established the belief within the company that you have IP that you're really going to invest in and it's going to be valuable for the company, you're going to make this investment, what kind of testing is there? What kind of analysis is there to test that hypothesis before you execute?
Yeah, we have a big initiative at Jam City called Player First, where to some extent we're removing ourselves from the process and we are putting our players first in the testing of our games. So we have a bunch of super fans, our insiders, Jam City insiders, that come to our office or participate online in a series of survey or qualitative testing where we present them with the IP, we try to gauge their sentiment, and we have an incredible consumer insight team that is able to provide us with a really detailed report on what categories of players feel close to the IP, what maybe has not worked for them. But it's a really an overtime hand-in-hand process where we refine and iterate to develop an IP that's going to really hone in on the core target and then expand it to ancillary markets.
Yeah, and I mean, following up on that, we have a similar type of program at Scopelys for trying to generate those consumer insights early on and often. But the great thing about working with original IP is there's also much less in the way of restrictions around how you quantitatively test it early. So we can, bring slices of gameplay to market, do a lot of direct research and understanding how users are responding to it, what types of players it's working with, and even what the interplay between the advertising creative that we're using and the core game experience is, and kind of optimizing that to make sure we're reaching the right audiences effectively.
I want to talk a little bit about your Star Trek example. So you've identified a piece of IP that you want to license in. It fits a mechanic you're interested in using. Maybe the partner, maybe not in that instance, but in another instance is not a good fit. To what extent does sort of the vision of the IP and perhaps friction with the partner come into play? And at what point is the partnership relationship perhaps not one that's worth going forward? And how should the audience kind of walk through those challenges if it's not the right partner?
Yeah, I mean, I think the important thing is, when you're working with an IP partner, they are the masters of their brand. They know it the best. And I think it's important to be able to show that you understand the world they're trying to build, the world they're trying to create for their IP, and you can create a compelling game experience that delivers on that world. I think where you run into conflict or friction is sometimes those IP holders have a very specific idea in mind for what type of game they want to build. And that type of game may not work mechanically, or may not be the type of game that you as a company are trying to build right now. And where I've seen problems or failures, oftentimes it stems from this mismatch between what the IP holder is envisioning from a game and what you as a game maker think is actually going to work successfully in market. We've seen examples of, actually, I don't want to get into too many examples of failures, but yeah, I think the gameplay mismatch with what the audience wants is the number one way you can fail, and that would be my number one walk away. If the IP holder is saying you can have access to this top tier IP, your dream IP, but the game we want you to make with it is X. If you don't believe in that game, it's not going to go well for anyone.
Yeah, and one more point. I think licensures have become a lot more savvy when it comes to mobile free-to-play games. A couple of years back, there was a real lack of education and understanding, and it was to be expected. It was still a very, very young market, and so there was this real separation between what, as Jori said, the licensor wanted to make, and the reality that what needs to be made in order to have a sustainable, viable business. But I've seen that gap kind of shrink year over year, and now most licensors tend to understand, because they've been through the tribulation of developing titles, some that worked, some that did not, and they brought more and more gaming expertise within their organization. But I've seen that gap shrink.
So let's assume the decision's been made. You found the right partner. It's the right IP for the right mechanic. You're going to go forward with a licensing deal. What are some of the contracting issues, terms that the audience should think about needing to work through as they put together that agreement to build that game?
Yeah, one, it's understanding what you're getting out of the deal, right? Is there a specific roster of character? Do you have access to all the location? What is the time period? I think having very, very clear stipulation in the agreement where you're getting exactly what you want out of the deal, and not wake up a year later and say, hey, but I thought I had access to character X. Well, no, character X was not specified in the agreement, and it has mixed rights, and so you can't access to it. Those are the things that I think you should always take, wait a second, list everything that you want with the game team, and make sure you come with a very, very specific list of requests.
Yeah, it's exactly along those lines. I mean, actor likenesses. If you're working with with an IP that has real actors, just understanding everything that you're actually paying for and getting. A lot of times, the theme song will not be included with the IP. That's a separate licensing fee or licensing arrangement. But there's some brands you can imagine if you didn't have the theme song, it would just feel like a crazy gap. Just understanding what you're actually getting for the license, and also what mechanical restrictions are going to be placed on you. You can probably verify whether this is true or not, but there's a rumor in the kind of Harry Potter ecosystem that you can't have active head-to-head combat, or at least historically could not.
Historically, I don't know. Moving on. And on top of kind of those material assets, what is the partner going to do for you, right? If, let's say, a big licensor does not provide you with any marketing support, then your game is probably not going to reach their audience anyway. So making sure that you're very clear and they're very clear on what's going to happen at soft launch, what is going to be the messaging, what do you have the rights to in terms of like, can you do an influencer campaign and what is that going to look like? Can you have your own Instagram page? Can you have, Twitch players streaming the game? I think all of those things need to be thought well in advance to avoid some last minute hiccups.
And I'll add, from the legal perspective, one of the things that I see be a hiccup a lot is the right of publicity issue. So there's a pretty iconic classic case in the legal space about, no doubt, Gwen Stefani suing over Gwen Stefani's use, her likeness playing no doubt games. And the argument was that wasn't included in the license agreement. And it really does come down to a contracting question. What does the contract say? And the issue, really was no one had thought ahead to what is this game, how are players going to play the game, and what's going to happen with Gwen Stefani's character when she's playing a no doubt song. And that led to quite a bit of litigation. So the right of publicity issue, is just an example, is one that is rather heavily litigated, and you really do need to know, what are your rights? Do you have the rights not just to the character, but to the actor's license? So I've seen the example of John Wick. You also need Keanu to agree if John Wick's going to look like Keanu. So thinking through those and knowing exactly, what's spelled out in the agreement is something I see quite often.
Get Keanu's likeness, but then do you have even his voice, which may be a separate set of rights?
Yeah, it's also important to think about future-proofing the agreement as well. So, how long is the term? How do you extend the term? And even, thinking about how our industry is evolving. I mean, as cross-platform play becomes more and more of a reality, do you have mobile-only rights? Does that extend to web, PC, console, everything else? What's defined as mobile, not mobile? These lines are getting much more blurry over time, and you don't want to be in a position where you're having to rethink that or re-engage further on down the road.
And not to pile on, but to pile on, right? So Google announces Stadia. So what's the next version of that iteration of gaming that's not a console platform that's been contemplated in the agreement? Do you have broad enough language in the agreement to allow for the future, rights that the studio wants to have as to the IP that they've brought in? I want to switch to sort of the marketing question and the branding question. When you're shepherding someone else's IP, in your own game, what are the branding, marketing issues you need to think through and work through, both with respect to your own brand, but the brand that you're, caretaking?
Yeah, I mean, it starts with style guides and approvals. First and foremost, understanding how your partner likes to work through their content and approving the use of their content. I've seen that be a real handicap for teams. And it really boils down to how well as a game maker and marketing team are you, delivering on those brand expectations and working within the process that your partner's comfortable with. So additional effort and investment in setting up the right process and the right expectations early on will massively change the efficiency of that funnel, which is critical for operating and marketing the game.
Yeah, and I go back to my previous comment about licensor becoming more and more savvy about running a mobile pipeline, and especially when it comes to UA assets, so social media, Facebook. You guys know better than me. It's all about speed, right? You need to iterate on creative. You need a lot of creatives. You need to test them. You need to iterate on optimizing them. But often those licensors, that's not their core business. Their core business is reviewing an asset. They're going to have a 10-day turnaround to give their first comment. Then you're going to modify it, send it back, 10-day turnaround. And that just doesn't work for you as a game maker, where you need to just constantly refresh your creative and really identify the strongest ones. So upfront, and it's never something you're going to get. You can't reduce that 10-day turnaround more often than not, but at least being very clear with the partner of hey, this is the frequency of asset delivery that you should expect from our marketing. It's going to be about 2 a day. And if you want us to be successful, and here's why we need it, here's a proof of why creatives matter, we expect you also to be a great partner. And most of the time, they'll understand if it's explained right. It's all about showing empathy about what they are shepherding and what they're representing. making sure they understand your perspective early, so that they are not shocked when you're dropping 50 creatives a week.
Yeah, it's a process of mutual education. I mean, in all honesty, you're going to be learning a massive amount about the brand in intimate detail that you probably didn't have before, and they're going to be learning a massive amount about how you're planning to utilize it in a space they might not be as familiar with. And so even simple things like showing creatives in context, like showing them on a mobile device instead of blown up on a massive big screen can be a real difference maker in that education process.
I have a little anecdote on that. On a game I've made, they always came back saying, the pupil of the character is 2 pixels too much to the right. And I'm like, Jesus, really? Who cares? It's invisible. And when finally we visited their office, we realized they were reviewing the assets on literally a screen about this big in a conference room. And we're like, oh, well, yeah, if you're looking at it at this size rather than like this, yes, the pupil is going to look very differently positioned than it should.
From a best practice for those in the audience that are thinking about licensing content, when do these expectation setting conversations happen? And is it reasonable to be having them even before you start negotiating the agreement?
Yeah, absolutely. The earlier, the better. I think it's important. I would rather not have an agreement than have an agreement that's not going to work out. So setting those expectations early, getting the right dialogue started, ensuring that you can come to a mutually workable process instead of understandings. It will save you so much effort and pain down the road.
And it's also understanding what is not going to make, what's not going to be in the agreement. Things like, hey, we want those 50 assets reviewed in 48-hour turnaround. That will never be in the agreement. Just understanding where you can modify terms and where things are the way they are, and you have to understand that's just like in any relationships, there's something you're gonna have to live with, is also very, very important rather than just being blocked on a couple of key terms.
When you're thinking about marketing the game, perhaps from the beginning, perhaps later, are you thinking about the brand whose IP you're licensing in their own marketing channels and how you might utilize those? And does that find its way into the agreement, or does that pop up later?
We tend to make sure that it's listed very, very clearly. I think for massive brands, I'm going to take Marvel, for example. Marvel is releasing multiple movies. They have announcement about the theme park, this new video game. So making sure you're carving out a space in time and a space in terms of placement is very, very important. Licensors, most of the time, they want to do good by you. They are partners, they really want to give you the best, but they live within an even bigger organization where, hey, maybe we've got this, even your game is cool, but we've got this massive, massive movie announcement, so they're going to take precedent over you. So making sure that you've listed very clearly when things needed to happen, how they needed to happen, it helps to alleviate those small issues that may occur during the execution of the agreement.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think it's critically important that you believe that as a standalone, even without the partner's support, you can market the product effectively. I think performance marketing is such a crucial part of our business that you should go in with a solid understanding of how that's likely to impact your metrics and be confident that the benefits you're going to see justify the extra overhead and expense of bringing in a licensed IP.
Can you speak specifically to marketing on social channels and the challenges that are there when you're marketing someone else's IP through social? And I'll add, with the confused faces, I'm thinking, as well to streaming content. And, it's one thing if you have agreements around advanced approvals and, that you have the approval to put a particular piece of content out there. It's something different when you're talking about the advantages of streaming a game and the challenges of, it not being something you entirely control.
Yeah, that's a very tough one. It has changed even in the past year, where I've seen last year a lot of our partners were requiring to have individual approval on every streamer that was going to stream the game, and they were, wanting pre-recorded versions prior to us kind of publishing them or showing them. The reality is something you can't control. you're lucky if PewDiePie records a video for you, but you're never gonna be able to ask for a pre-recorded stream. Same thing on Twitch. So I think now everybody understands that this is something that is beyond the scope of a mutual agreement.
Yeah, I think it really comes down to a very, very high degree of comfort that usually comes from a track record of representing the brand well across multiple formats leading up to that. We've done some things in the live streaming social media areas, but it's always come from, it's never the first thing that we're bringing to the table, right? But after you've done lots of in-game content approvals, lots of marketing assets, lots of these kind of proof points that you are representing the brand in the right way and treating the brand with the right level of respect, then you can unlock some of these opportunities for really fun, interesting, live, creative things. I'm just thinking back to when we launched Looney Tunes World of Mayhem, we did a Crush-a-thon Acme live stream where we literally had this room set up and we were dropping anvils on all types of stuff and had some social media influencers involved, and Warner was very supportive of the whole process. But again, that was a long way down the partnership path versus a day one kind of initiative.
And you said respect the brand. I think there's also respect the end user, right? They're so passionate of the brand you're working on. They really want it to be the best it can be. And sometimes things are going to happen, and just showing an ability to resolve those concerns and talking with the community and making sure that things do not balloon. Obviously, licensors are very sensitive to any sort of negative PR. And if you're able to show your ability to foster a positive community, that's also going to go a long way.
I wanted to add, one of the things that I see when it comes to social or it comes to like a live event is addendums. And it's not necessarily, a big complicated formal addendum. Maybe it's, something that's an email agreement, but it's an afterthought. It's not usually in the main licensed in agreement. So from a planning perspective, you might be hoping that a game becomes popular enough where you are having, cosplay at a particular conference and at someone's booth, and but that's not usually in the plan from the get-go, at least from what I've seen from my perspective, that it's a later in the process, to your point, having been a good steward and a good partner, that you can get there.
We've had plenty of addendums that were added by email and added last minute. What really matters is showing a well thought out process to the partner, is sending them a presentation, explain, hey, we never talked about it before, but we see a huge opportunity with us, having a special drink at Starbucks, for example, or anything along those lines, something that's going to be celebrating the brand and please consumers. So just having something that shows a mock-up, hey, and this is a random example, right? But here's a normal Starbucks, and we make it cool, like Star Trek, and there's going to be baristas in the red outfit, and this is why players are going to like it, etc. If you're able to show confidence in that project and it's additive to the brand, 9 times out of 10, partners like that their brand is celebrated. So it's not a huge issue.
We've talked a lot about the licensed in marketing piece. Let's talk a little bit about marketing your own original IP. And there's a loud group outside, so sorry, I'm going to speak up a little bit more. So what are some of the challenges from building that following around your own original IP? And I'm not talking user acquisition and some of the other panels that we've really seen, but getting to the point where you are executing on that vision for your own IP. What are some of the marketing challenges and opportunities, and how might that be different from how we've been talking about marketing IP so far?
Yeah, I think the upfront investment in understanding your audience and identifying your audience is very different. Because when you're working with an existing IP, there's been oftentimes years, if not decades, of this understanding of who this audience is. Your licensor has brand guidelines. They have all these different things to kind of bring to the table around who you should be building this game for. When you're building your own brand, your own world, you have to define who that is and make sure the thing you're building actually matches those expectations and matches that definition. So it's a much more iterative process of, bringing the game toward the audience you want and then redefining the audience as you understand your game better. Because if those things are misaligned, you're kind of dead before you start.
Agreed.
I got the time signal, so I just wanted to flag. We're happy to. We have about 10 minutes. I have a couple more questions. If you all have questions, you can submit them, and we will take questions, or you can raise your hand and yell loudly, and we'll answer them too. I wanted to talk about global marketing. Mobile has the benefit of being global, but not every audience is the same. Not everything resonates with the same audience. Can you talk to marketing a global IP, both your own, the licensed in, the challenges there that need to be thought through in terms of building and working with an IP to have a really successful game?
Yeah, I think the one thing I've learned about international expansion is most likely you're not the right person to do it. I think, Western, in my case, European, American, I don't know what the audience in China or India or Japan really wants. And often my guesses are going to be completely wrong. So there's multiple ways to tackle that. One is hiring people who have a real cultural understanding of that market. If they're in LA, in San Francisco, wonderful, and they can work with the right creative to create, marketing assets, posters, UA assets. And if you don't have this ability to attract talent, then highly recommend to partner with companies that are going to be able to help you in those markets.
Yeah, I think having a granular lens on which markets matter to you is step number one, because what I've seen is basically the amount of investment you put into international markets is commensurate with the level of rewards you reap from them. And, saying we're going to attack Europe just doesn't make sense, right? I mean, these markets are very, very different. And, Asia is probably even more extreme, the difference between China, Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia. Even Southeast Asia has a lot of nuance between various countries. So choosing your target markets and then, understanding what level of depth of investment you're going to put into it. There's localization, then there's kind of localizing your marketing assets to fit with the way products are marketed there, marketing channels, then getting into in-game culturalization. You can go very, very deep, and that might be worth the ROI. But if you're doing it broad or in a generalist kind of fashion, I think the results are generally underwhelming as well.
Can you expect to receive data or information from your partner that will help you make those localization decisions?
I would say in many cases, yes. I think it really depends on the maturity of the IP and the channels that IP has been distributed through historically. I think, for example, if it's a movie, you might be primarily getting box office results from a number of countries, which is some amount of data, but not necessarily all the data you need to make great decisions. But for some of these licenses, when you take a Marvel type of IP, they've been in multiple formats, multiple types of media, multiple geos, multiple shots on goal. So I think there's a pretty rich amount of information and know-how that you can access going in.
So one final question before we open it up to the audience for questions. Any final tips, thoughts for the audience in terms of how to, take IP and turn it into a winning game, which is the topic of our panel?
One, which is really the most important, is make sure there's a correlation between the genre you want to enter and the IP. Just mixing two things that are popular, like, let's take this big IP and this casual genre. More often than not, is not the right approach. I think this is not necessarily just a additive business calculation. You really need to understand the audience. It's almost like a method acting type of setup where you need to become the audience. You need to immerse yourself in the IP, understand what those fans want, and make sure you're delivering on the fantasy of that brand. And that comes even before you have conversation with the partner. For Jam City Scopelys, I think it's easy. We know the people at most of the big licensing companies. But if you're a smaller player as a developer, I think something that is well thought out, that shows you care, that shows you love the IP, that you're going to shepherd it well, it goes a really long way, because ultimately the people that work at all of those big IPs, they just want to make sure that they're going to deliver not just on revenue, but also on something that's going to be additive to the end user experience.
Yeah, I mean, I echo a lot of those sentiments. I think the most important thing you can do is give the audience what they want, right? Deliver on the world of that IP. And I think the best first step to deliver on that world is to become as much of an expert and immerse yourself to the full extent possible. There's one quick anecdote. When I started working on The Walking Dead: Road to Survival, I didn't know that much about the Walking Dead world at the time, honestly, but I bought literally the entire comic book set and every book that had been published in the world and read them all and watched every episode of the TV show again. And then, basically made it a team-wide mandate. Anyone who touches product, design, anything that's player-facing also has to read the entire comic book collection and watch every episode of the show. Because then that everyone going in is going to have, a real level of familiarity and understanding, and just be that much better suited to represent that world accurately.
And hire the right talent. Another example is for Harry Potter, we hired a professor from NYU that was giving a course on Harry Potter, and he became our lead writer. And it's really not something you can invent, like, hey, I like Harry Potter, I've read all the books, but could I expand the world? No way. But someone he's got like deep understanding of the brand, he's gonna do wonders that you can't. And last tip, IPs there's always a bit of like fascination, like, hey, I'm a total nerd, of course I want to work on Marvel, Star Wars, Harry Potter, all of those brands, but make sure that the math makes sense. Make sure to look at the financials and drill into the agreement of like, hey, what's the rev share? Who's handling UA? Who's paying for marketing? Is there some sort of co-payment? Really drill down into it, because you can make a great game, but some companies literally have lost their shirt because at the end of the day they were losing money by developing the title because they could not run a sustainable business.
Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.